Our position was very risky. Having recovered from the unexpected attack, the garrison of the fort launched a counterattack against us. We defended ourselves by taking up positions in the fort's defenses. The Belgians were armed with rifles. We held up their advance with machine gun and submachine gun fire. But we did not have endless ammunition, and they had a tenfold numerical superiority. During the battle, however, I fortunately did not think about it. Otherwise, I would have gotten scared, started acting wrong, and would have surely caught an enemy bullet. But survival instinct made me think only about what was important at that moment. So I fired my MP-38, trying not to let the Belgians get close. And they got scared first, and their counterattack failed. Nevertheless, our assault group was still on the brink of death. In the vicinity of the fort was pulled artillery Belgian units. The enemy's guns fired incessantly at the part of the fort we occupied. Later in one of the sources I found a figure. It turns out that the Belgians fired more than 2,000 shells at us that day. At 11 a.m., we were to be replaced by the 51st Engineer Battalion and the 151st Infantry Regiment. But because the Belgians blew up the bridges over the Maas River, our units never reached the fort that day. It would be a miracle if we are not attacked by the Belgian units drawn to the fort, Summer told me. By this time, I realized that I was unlikely to return home alive. But I'd been through a lot of fighting, and I wasn't thinking like I used to. I felt insanely sorry that I would die like this, and that I would never see Ingrid or Kurt again. But I was also very angry, so I was going to do everything in my power to make the enemy pay the maximum price for our lives. It would be a miracle if I took less than 10 Belgians with me, I answered Summer, grinning grimly. He patted me on the shoulder. Our units should come at least by nightfall, and until night we will somehow hold out. The Luftwaffe guys helped us a lot in this situation. They periodically flew in and bombed the Belgian troops pulled to the fort. However, we had an anxious, very turbulent night ahead of us. The German troops who were to come to our aid did not arrive at the fort until early the next morning. As I learned later, an attack was actually being prepared against us by an infantry division occupying positions near Ibn Emil. However, it did not take place. The Belgians were simply not ready for decisive action in the event of war. With the appearance of German sappers and an infantry regiment, our mission was virtually completed. We were no longer afraid of enemy attacks. We allowed ourselves to relax a little. We wanted to talk to each other, because we had just accomplished the impossible. With the strength of a tiny handful of people, we actually stormed the most impregnable European fort and were able to hold it for a whole day. But most importantly, we survived. Let's get acquainted. Summer approached the parachutist, who yesterday beat the Belgian grenade like a tennis ball. Let me explain. As I said, the secrecy during the preparation of the operation reached absurdity. And being new to the group, Summer and I really didn't know all the members of our group by name. Our new buddy's name was Conrad. He thanked me again for saving his life. You probably saved the lives of some of us too, when you repelled that grenade, I replied. By the way, how did you do it? I did it automatically. I guess it was a reaction. Before the army, when I was still at school, I practiced various sports. What kind of sports? A lot of them, but first of all soccer and wrestling. Girls especially like wrestlers and soccer players. We all smiled and Summer laughed. Conrad, don't talk about girls in front of Gunther. He is married, and he already has a child. Now Conrad also laughed with Summer. And what's wrong with the fact that I'm married? I asked, involuntarily starting to laugh with them. Nothing. Summer and Conrad replied in unison. All three of us laughed until we were in tears. Perhaps there was nothing particularly funny about the scene, but after what we had experienced, our reaction was quite natural. We just needed to release our emotions. Around noon, the garrison of Ibn Emil officially surrendered. By this point, the fort was already surrounded by our infantry. Our assault team's losses totaled only 6 men killed and about 20 wounded, some of whom were not even wounded by the enemy, but by the not-so-successful landing of our transport gliders. By this point, Koch's other 3 assault groups had captured important crossings necessary for the advance of Wehrmacht troops. The war with Belgium promised to be a victorious one, and it turned out to be just that. On May 20, we learned that Heinz Guderian's panzer units had reached the Atlantic coast, cutting off a huge army of French and British soldiers from their depots and supply lines. Despite several subsequent counterattacks, the German army was able to hold its ground in the fighting, and Belgium capitulated on May 28. With the fall of Belgium, our troops were able to unleash all their forces on France. On June 12, German units entered Paris, and on June 25, France recognized its defeat. It was occupied by German troops. The whole world was amazed by what had happened. I myself was surprised that our army was able to succeed so quickly. However, the war had already changed me. I had no sympathy for the defeated French. I had become a soldier in the full sense of the word. I realized that in order to survive, enemies must be considered enemies, no matter what the circumstances. We had no choice. At least I personally had a sure feeling. Either Germany would win the huge war that had broken out or perish. The next 9 months were relatively quiet for the Wehrmacht. The war with Britain was fought mainly by the Luftwaffe, and the infantry could be of little use here. Hitler was extremely pleased with our operation to storm Ibn Emil. He personally met with our assault team, making a short speech. He was an excellent orator. I have always been skeptical of Nazi ideology, but after seeing Hitler in person, remained under his spell for several days. Later, in the memoirs of people close to the Führer, I read more than once that he literally emanated some energy that made you believe every word he said, and it was really true. Our whole group experienced it for themselves. After the speech, Hitler talked with our officers. After a while, I happened to see a propaganda photo. It showed the Führer, Lieutenant Meissner, Oberleutnant Zurich, and Captain Walter Koch together. We were all awarded for the storming of Ibn Emil. I was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class, but most importantly, each of us received a month's leave. At home, it was as if I was in another world that was once again foreign to me, but I already knew what to do. I helped my mother and Ingrid bake bread and played with my son Kurt. He was already 2 years old and could speak a lot of words, but I especially liked the way he said the word daddy, with a special feeling, not like other words. But then I felt sad when I thought, maybe he pronounced it differently than the others because he didn't fully believe that this stranger was his daddy, and he was afraid that I wouldn't be with him for long. Meanwhile, my vacation was really coming to an end. During the last week, Ingrid asked me one day, "How long do you think this will last?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your service. When will you come home?" "When we win." "But we've already defeated France." "Yes, but now we have to defeat Britain. It will be soon, I'm sure of it." I started kissing Ingrid to stop her thinking bad thoughts. I must say I believed in German victory myself. Besides, I had been enlisted for 4 years and had already served more than half of that time. When I returned to the base, this time I was especially sad to be on the train, but the intense training helped me think less about home. We parachuted at least once a week and went to the rifle range almost every day. On a day off, we got our layoffs, and Summer and Conrad dragged me out with them to a beer hall. We had a good drink and even sang songs. On the way back to the barracks, the future looked, if not rosy, then quite bearable. However, fate was already preparing new dangerous trials for us. In early April 1941, the Wehrmacht troops entered Yugoslavia. Before the German army could fully occupy this country, German troops also attacked Greece, the defense of which was carried out by both Greeks and British units. Yugoslavia capitulated on April 14, while Greece managed to hold out until April 30. Less than 2,000 German soldiers were killed during these 2 operations. The scale of fighting was much smaller than in Poland and Western Europe. Nevertheless, German control of Greece did not mean control of the Eastern Mediterranean, as the island of Crete remained in the hands of the British. Crete was of great strategic importance and was a natural springboard for a possible invasion of the Balkans by our enemies. Thus, the island was an important Allied naval and air base, which posed a constant threat to the Axis countries, and in particular to the oil fields of Ploiesti. However, the German Navy did not have sufficient forces to land a naval landing, because the British ships completely controlled the coastal waters. As a result, the German command decided to use us, parachutists, to take Crete. This was a non-standard and very bold move. In the world practice before, there was no case of using such a large-scale airborne landing. Thus, even before the end of hostilities in Greece, we began to prepare for the operation to capture Crete, which was codenamed Mercury. The operation plan was developed by General Kurt Student. The final version of this plan implied the capture of airfields by the 7th Parachute Division and the transfer of the 5th Mountain Division. The total strength of these two divisions was about 23,000 men. Of these, 10,000 were to land on the island, jumping from parachutes, 750 men, delivered by gliders, and another 7,000 by means of the German Navy. Air support for the operation was entrusted to the 8th Luftwaffe Army, which had 280 horizontal bombers and 150 dive bombers and fighters. According to the calculations of the German command, our forces were to oppose 25 to 30,000 enemy fighters. However, as it turned out later, Crete was defended by 15,000 British soldiers, 7,000 Australian, and almost as many New Zealand fighters, about 12,000 soldiers of the regular Greek army, and in addition, several thousand more local partisans and militia. Thus, our paratroopers had to operate at twice the numerical superiority of the enemy. Once again, the paratroopers were required to accomplish the impossible. On the night of May 20, we arrived at the airfield. We were to jump to the island with a parachute, and this was especially troubling for Summer and me. Because of the design of the German parachutes, we could not jump with our rifles. They would just get caught in the slings during the jump. That's why most of the parachutists' weapons were dropped in special containers. At first I was thinking of putting my rifle in the container, but Summer talked me out of it. First of all, you can't be sure that the scope won't be damaged in the fall, he told me. Secondly, even if the scope is intact, it will probably be jammed, and the rifle will have to be retargeted anyway. And thirdly, are you sure you'll land exactly next to your container? But what to do? I asked. I would take the scope with me, and then attach it to the first rifle I came across and shoot it during the battle. This prospect did not please me, but there were no other options. Perhaps Summer and I were even a little envious of Conrad, who specialized in close combat and preferred to use MP-38 and grenades. The MP-38 submachine gun had the advantage that it could be attached under the parachute suspension system and jumped with it. That is why Summer and I also took a submachine gun with us, especially since I had already experienced that the MP-38 was a great complement to the sniper rifle. The operation began with a bombardment of the island by our heavy bombers. After that, the first wave of paratroopers was landed on the island at dawn. The defenders of Crete began shelling them while they were still in the air. Immediately afterward, a bloody battle ensued. A lot of the guys died. Summer, Conrad, and I were fortunate enough to be in the second wave of the landing party. We were to be dropped a little west of the town of Melun. We were required to take the airfield of the same name. We were loaded into one of 50 junkers prepared for departure. In each airplane fit a platoon of 20 parachutists. There were no portholes in the junkers for us to look through during the flight, so we just looked at our feet. I pulled out my medallion. I always made sure to get at least a glimpse of Ingrid and Kurt's pictures before a fight. It was my talisman. From the beginning of the flight, we hardly spoke to each other. Everyone was focused, immersed in their own thoughts. Nevertheless, we were optimistic. We believed that we could accomplish our task and hoped that almost none of us would die. We did not yet know that we were walking into a trap. The British knew about our operation in advance and were well prepared for it. On their side was numerical superiority, and in addition, their fleet was ready to prevent the German ships to the island, which were to deliver a large part of our troops and heavy guns, vital to the operation. The monotonous roar of the engines was lulling and at the same time pressing on the nerves. One of ours sang the parachutist's song. The marching rhythm of the song made our souls feel lighter, and its words reflected exactly what we felt at that moment. The red sun is burning. Be ready. Are we destined to see it again tomorrow? Friend, don't be timid and rev up the engine. And start and go and beat your enemies. All aboard. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Friend, there's no turning back. Black clouds are gathering in the east. Let's go. Don't be shy. Let's go. With the roar of the engines we'll be sad for a moment, remembering our loved ones and our home. Soon we'll leap from the sides of the boat to crash straight down on our enemies. We'll leap from the sky. We'll leap from the sky. Friend, there's no turning back now. Black clouds are gathering in the east. Come on. Don't be timid, come on. We are few in number. Our blood is wild. We're not afraid of death. We're not afraid of our enemies. The voice of Germany is in our breast. We may lay down our heads, but we'll win. To the gun, comrade. Into the gun, comrade. Friend, there's no turning back. Black clouds are gathering in the east. Forward. Don't be timid, forward. We sang the song, but then there was silence again. Soon, we were approaching the island. We began to hear the rumble of guns and machine gun bursts. One of the explosions occurred very close to our junkers, and it became clear to us that we were being fired from anti-aircraft guns. I'm sure many of us began to pray to ourselves at that moment. Our airplane could well have crashed into the Mediterranean Sea without ever reaching its target. Finally, we were given the command to prepare for the jump. We lined up along the fuselage and attached the carabiners of our parachutes to a special longitudinal beam. Sommer and I shook hands and muttered, "See you on the ground." We were prevented from speaking properly by the ends of the hoses of our parachutes, which we had to hold in our teeth. Conrad stood behind us, and we also shook hands, repeating the same words. Soon, one by one, we began to jump out of the junkers. I jumped right after Sommer, and Conrad had to jump after me. It's a very scary feeling when you jump upside down, with shells exploding all around you and the air filled with bullets. But then my parachute opened. I had to rely on fate, focus, and look around. The town of Malame could be seen below a few kilometers east of where we were to land. From somewhere below, heavy machine guns were firing at us parachutists in the air. The lights of tracer bullets flashed in the air now and then. Some of them flew only a few meters away from me. And after all, cartridges with tracer bullets, if they were inserted into machine gun belts, then through a few ordinary cartridges. Thus, there were many more bullets flying through the air than could be seen. Then I saw one of our parachutists hanging lifelessly from his parachute, riddled by a coup. Then another and another. After another shell burst, I saw one of our transport junkers begin to fall, engulfed in flames. My nerves gave out. I started praying, and I barely had time to group myself properly at the moment of landing, so I almost twisted my leg. Because of this, I didn't have time to extinguish my parachute immediately, and it dragged me a few meters until one of the skydivers who had landed a little earlier piled on its dome. I started to get rid of the parachute, but I could not unbuckle it. My fingers did not obey me. Suddenly, Sommer jumped up to me. He forcefully shook me. "Gunther, do not panic. Son of a bitch, you'll get yourself shot if you panic." This sobered me up. Unhooked from the parachute, I together with Sommer hurried to the containers with weapons. Luckily, we landed behind a hill where enemy bullets could not reach, so we reached the small arms container without adventures. We immediately took a K98 carbine each, but we decided not to waste time on setting the sights, but to do it later. After hanging the carbines on our shoulders, we rushed to the ammunition container. I must say that it was relatively easy for us to navigate here, because we used parachutes of different colors to mark the contents of the containers. I should also note that among the weapons we received for this operation, the containers contained MG-34 hand machine guns, one per squad. In addition, to make up for the lack of heavy weapons, we had 75mm recoilless guns LG-40. They weighed only 130 kilograms. That is 10 times less than the field 75mm guns, and their range was only one-third less. Meanwhile, more and more parachutists landed around us. Just like us, they were rushing to the containers to arm themselves. There were many who were less fortunate than we were. They landed on the other side of the hill, which was under enemy fire. Some of them did not even manage to run to the containers. When our entire group landed, it became clear that about half of its men had been killed during the landing. However, we had no time to think about it. We hastily began to move towards the airfield. When we advanced about a kilometer, we were literally deafened by the rumble of battle. We saw a small group of German parachutists. These were the few survivors of the first wave of paratroopers that landed in the area. They were being fired upon by several hundred Allied soldiers huddled in trenches on a nearby hill. The entire area around was literally strewn with dead paratroopers. We began to cautiously approach our own, firing continuously in the direction of the enemy. But the situation was not in our favor. The enemy had well-fortified positions, and we could only use the rough terrain as cover. However, soon German dive bombers appeared in the sky. They dropped several bombs on a hill occupied by the enemy. The deafening roar of the explosions literally made my ears pop. Some of the bombs exploded only a few dozen meters from our positions. This short bombardment caused some panic in the ranks of the enemy. As a result, we were able to get almost close to the hill. Nevertheless, our enemies were not going to retreat. The battle continued. Sommer and I were ordered to destroy enemy artillerymen and snipers from a long distance. We were given complete freedom of action. That was encouraging. Now we could not only take better care of our own skins, but also bring more value to the attack. Sommer and I decided to stick together. We found a comfortable position and began digging a small trench for ourselves. About 100 paces away from us, a shell collapsed and exploded. This made us work faster. Soon our trench was ready. We put telescopic sights on our rifles, took our positions, and opened fire up the hill. There were so many targets there that we didn't even need spotters. Looking through the telescopic sight, I saw several heads of British and New Zealand soldiers huddled in the trenches. Several of them were armed with machine guns, and one even had a rifle with a telescopic sight. I was already aiming my scope at him, but suddenly I heard Sommer's shot, followed by a swear word. Damn that unloaded rifle. I pulled the trigger, but I missed too. There is nothing worse for a sniper than to work with a weapon he has not yet had time to shoot. The only thing that saved us was that the enemy sniper was probably a beginner. On the third attempt, I got used to my new rifle, and my bullet hit him accurately. However, a second earlier, Sommer's bullet had also entered the British sniper's head. Let me shoot at the targets on the left side of the hill, and you on the right, I suggested to him. That'll do, he replied, and immediately pulled the trigger again. I found another target too. It was a New Zealand machine gunner. His position was protected by sandbags filled with sand. However, his head was perfectly visible. I fired, but I thought my bullet only hit the edge of his helmet. Damn that unloaded rifle. I repeated to myself Sommer's words. Nevertheless, the machine gunner still fell to the ground. Perhaps he was just frightened or concussed. Another soldier immediately jumped up to take his place, but before he could fire, I put a bullet in him. This time it went right through the middle of his face. I quickly pulled the bolt again. A third soldier flew up to the machine gun. To my surprise, I hit him exactly in the eye. When the bullet hit the soldier, he was literally thrown back. Well, I guess you can get used to any rifle. I waited another half a minute, but no one else approached the machine gun. Then I looked for another target. The position of the mortars came into my sight. They were almost invisible behind the sandbags, but their gunner poked his head out with binoculars, unconcerned. I fired. My bullet pierced the wrist of his hand holding the binoculars and entered his head. The mortar men themselves were unharmed, however, and the mortar fired another mine. I waited to see if at least one of the mortarmen would be foolish enough to stick his head out. He did, and my bullet hit him in the face. However, the other mortarman was smarter. He kept firing, keeping his head completely down from behind the bags. There was nothing I could do about it. After that, I destroyed 4 more machine gunners. I had no serious targets left, so I started firing at the regular gunners. After destroying 4 of them, I suddenly saw another sniper. With him was the gunner, whose binoculars were pointed directly at our sniper position. A cold sweat broke out on me, but I was not confused and immediately shot at the sniper's head. My bullet entered her just above the chin. The sniper didn't seem to realize what had happened. He kept looking through his binoculars. I quickly pulled the bolt and shot him. Having killed the gunner, I stopped firing for a short period of time and sank down into the trench to recover a little. "What's wrong?" I heard Summers' voice. We had just been spotted by a British sniper. He had a spotter. I killed them both. Then was a good spotter. But I'm afraid we've got to get our asses out of here anyway. We've been sitting in one place too long. Yeah, it's time to change positions, I agreed. Not far from us, about 300 meters from the hill occupied by the Allies, was a small olive grove. It was a little closer to the enemy positions than we would have liked, but there was no fire in its direction at all, and there we could at least disguise ourselves. We dug a new small trench and covered it with olive branches so that it would not be too conspicuous. Once we were in it, we noticed that by now the Allied soldiers were trying to keep their heads out of the trenches. After all, our parachutists had given them some heat. Suddenly another artillery shell exploded in the center of the German positions. Sommer and I began to look through the enemy positions, but we could not find the gun that had fired the shell. However, we did see 4 British tanks moving from the east toward our paratroopers' trenches. The tanks were accompanied by about 100 infantrymen. As they approached the parachutists' positions, the tanks began firing from cannons and machine guns. Our guys returned fire. The tanks were immediately hit by our LG-40 guns. Apparently, they had already been set in position to repel the tank attack. Soon 2 of the tanks ahead of them caught fire. The other 2 began to retreat with the infantry. The British artillery increased their fire, aiding their retreat. Unfortunately, their guns were somewhere beyond our line of sight, so Sommer and I were only able to kill a few of the retreating infantrymen, and the 2 British tanks withdrew safely. In our second trench, we stayed for several more hours, having killed during this time about half a dozen enemy soldiers and 4 machine gunners. Soon it began to get dark. The night was not much calmer than the day. From time to time, there were explosions of shells and mines fired from mortars. Every now and then shots rang out, and often it was impossible to understand who was firing and from where. Every rustle seemed suspicious to me. Several times I had the feeling that someone was crawling towards our trench. It was impossible to sleep in such a situation. In order not to be taken by surprise, Sommer and I decided not to stop watching. Several times we fired at the cigarette lights that appeared on the hill. After each such shot, we immediately scrambled into our foxhole, for the British usually noticed the flashes at the ends of our barrels and returned fire in our direction. After this happened a third time, we decided it was no longer worth the risk. After all, we could have been hit by artillery as well. "Lie down for at least an hour. I'll watch alone," Sommer told me. I lay down at the bottom of the trench with my MP-38 beside me. It might be more useful than a carbine in case the enemy suddenly came at us. However, the silence was broken time, and again by gunshots and explosions. As a result, I simply couldn't fall asleep to their noise because of the nervous tension I had accumulated during the day. Max, I called Sommer by his name. Lately, I often called him that when we talked about something personal. "What do you think about this war?" "It's hard to say. Summer went down into the trench and lit a cigar from his army ration. He smoked it at the bottom of the trench so that the light at the end of the cigar could not be seen by the enemy. I took a deep breath. I wish I'd never had any of this in my life. But it already has, Summer grinned. And probably we couldn't do without a war with Poland. And we should have annexed the Sudets to Germany all the more. And France and Britain themselves declared war on us. Yes, there was no choice. I agreed. Summer's words were comforting. He believed in what he was saying. I had almost learned to think the same way myself. A soldier must believe that he is fighting for the right cause. Then he has a better chance of survival. Why the hell did the British have to do all this? I asked Summer. Did they really think they could defeat Germany? Maybe they'll try to drag the Americans into the war. The British always drag the Americans into everything. Max, did you have to fight the Americans in World War I? Yes, I did. Summer yawned tiredly. On the Western Front we were all tired of fighting, both us and the French. And then fresh American troops descended on us. We didn't manage to push them back. Do you have any Americans on your sniper account? I asked the question and immediately realized how ridiculous it was, given Summer's skills. You're still asking? He grinned back. By the way, they had good snipers. One of them killed my comrade. There was silence. I thought about the fact that my father died on the Western Front. Who knows, maybe it wasn't a Frenchman who killed him, but an American. I heard that the Americans are not the same now, said Summer. They probably don't want to get their asses off their couches, but either way we'll win. Hitler knows what he's doing. He's Austrian. Yes, Austrians are smart people, if they're all like you. I patted Summer on the shoulder. Our Führer can't be wrong. When I said the last phrase, I was surprised that I said those words. Only a year ago, they would have seemed to me an empty propaganda slogan. But now I wanted so much to believe in them. At least it would justify everything that was going on around me. Soon Summer asked if I would be willing to watch alone for a couple of hours while he took a nap. I didn't feel like sleeping at all, so I agreed. Unlike me, Summer fell asleep immediately. After about 2.5 hours, he woke up on his own, though I didn't wake him up. You should get some sleep too, he told me. Otherwise you will be useless in battle tomorrow. To my surprise, I fell asleep almost as soon as I lay down at the bottom of the trench. The night passed relatively quietly for us. The enemy did not attack us, and not a single shell burst near our trench. As soon as it started to get light, we saw a German liaison who was trying to find our position. Sommer called out to him, and he ran toward us. The contact looked very out of breath. Apparently he had to travel a long way before he found us. The contact informed us that in about an hour the rest of the paratroopers would begin their assault on the hill, and we, as snipers, should do our best to help their advance. What is the situation in general? Sommer asked. The case is lousy, replied the liaison. The commander of our unit died yesterday. The second-in-command officer is seriously wounded. Therefore, the command is carried out by a lieutenant. Ordinary soldiers in general died more than half. And no one knows where is this damn gun, which is pounding on us, I asked. It is somewhere behind the hill, answered the liaison. But where exactly? This we have not been able to determine. When our bombers appear in the air, the British hide their cannon. Damn it, cussed Sommer. How many enemies have you already destroyed? Asked the liaison. Not less than 50 for 2, I answered. The contact's eyes widened. Is it really that many? Yes, confirmed Sommer. First of all, we tried to destroy all the machine gunners who were in our firing zone. Guys, you're crazy. That's very good. The liaison cheered up. We must take this damn hill today, at any cost. Otherwise we'll die. Why? I asked. This is the dominant height in front of the airfield. We need resupplies, ammunition, and artillery. They can only get them to us if we take the airfield. What about our landing from the sea? Sommer asked. We were told that 2 full battalions would land from the sea. They were attacked by the English fleet, answered the liaison. Of the guys, few survived, but our aviation took revenge on the British. When they were already leaving, our dive bombers properly bombed the British fleet. They say that among other ships managed to sink 2 British cruisers. I see, Sommer replied grimly. Then we'll have to take the Dan airfield today. The liaison ran to the next trench where the paratroopers were sitting. It was a few dozen meters away from us. He was immediately fired on from the hill, but he managed to run and duck into the trench. I was dumbfounded by what I heard. Sommer patted me on the shoulder. Gunther, we will definitely take the airfield, he said. Now is not the time to fall into despondency. We must support the attack. It's okay, I just did not expect that we will be in such a difficult position, I replied. It's time to change positions, said Sommer. When the contact ran away from here, the British must have noticed the approximate location of our trench. If a sniper starts sniping at them from this side, they can fire back at us pretty accurately. We quickly chose a new position behind a thicket of bushes and dug another trench there. After that, we started looking for suitable targets. Today, the British were being cautious and trying to keep their heads out of the trenches. I noticed a periscope sticking out of a trench. The soldier who was looking through it could watch our positions from deep inside the trench. I could not reach him with my bullet, and then, taking good aim, I fired at the periscope. If memory serves me right, I hit it the first time. After that, the periscope was, to put it mildly, unfit for observation. I think that the cunning man who decided to use it was also frightened at the moment when my bullet hit the periscope. A few minutes after that, ours began firing on the hill from machine guns and LG-40 guns. This was a preparation before the assault. Our opponents scrambled into their trenches. Then the paratroopers began to crawl towards the hill. I saw one of the British peek out of a trench to see what was going on. I took aim at him and fired, but at the last moment he turned his head to look the other way, and my bullet pierced his nose, but did not seem to enter his skull. Nevertheless, I imagine he screamed in pain. However, I could not hear his screams over the din of the battle. The parachutists were already at a distance of grenade throwing from the enemy's advanced positions, and naturally, German grenades immediately flew into the enemy trenches. Sommer and I tried to hit as many British as possible, popped out of the trenches and opened fire on our comrades. Gunther, look at the upper trenches. I heard Sommer's voice. I moved my sight there and saw 3 Allied soldiers at the same time leaning out of their trench. 2 of them had rifles in their hands and the third had a grenade. I immediately shot one of the gunners in the head while Sommer hit the soldier with the grenade. The third rifleman immediately dived into the trench before Sommer, and I had a chance to pull the bolts. For about half a minute, I continued to hold his trench in my sights, hoping that the enemy gunner would poke his head out again, but he was in no hurry to do so, and I began to look for a new target. Meanwhile, our fighters continued to storm the hill, climbing higher and higher up its slope. Sommer and I destroyed more and more enemies who tried to prevent the advance of the parachutists. At that time, 3 German transport gliders crashed onto the beach behind us. I noticed them only out of the corner of my eye, but did not pay much attention to them. However, as it turned out later, it was these gliders that were loaded with ammunition, so much needed by our troops storming the hill. In about 10 or 20 minutes, about 100 more gliders appeared in the sky. They were landing a few hundred meters east of the hill on which the Allies had entrenched themselves. On board each of the gliders were 10 parachutists. Thus, an additional force of 1,000 fighters was thrown to us. However, the Allied forces were also pulled to the landing place of the gliders, and almost immediately we could hear the sounds of battle coming from there. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Allied soldiers who had occupied the part of the hill that was visible to Sommer and me began to retreat. During the retreat, many of them were killed or wounded, for as soon as they left the trenches, German bullets came flying in their direction. I myself killed 3 enemy soldiers when they tried to run over the top of the hill. I think Sommer managed to shoot them 1.5 or 2 times more. The paratroopers who had landed east of the hill had now reached it and were also climbing to the top, driving the enemy out. The British and New Zealanders had no choice but to retreat under our onslaught. Soon Sommer and I saw a liaison man appear near our former trench. "Go and tell that idiot where we are," Sommer muttered. By this time, the battle had already moved to the other side of the hill, and I bent down and ran toward the contact. It was almost harmless, especially since I was covered by Sommer, with his keen sniper's eye. I explained to the liaison that we had to change positions after his last appearance. When he and I jumped into the trench, Sommer immediately asked the contact, "What news?" "We control the whole hill. The lieutenant wants you to take up positions at the top of the hill. From there you will be able to shoot the airfield and the surrounding area." Once on top of the hill, Sommer and I saw that the airfield had already been captured and the first Junkers 52 was landing on its runway. During its landing and the landing of the soldiers, enemy guns and machine guns behind the airfield were firing at them relentlessly. As I learned later, the airplanes were used to transfer to us replenishment from the fighters of the 5th Mountain Division. Together with fresh forces, the Junkers also delivered to the airfield several 105mm artillery pieces and 75mm Czechoslovak anti-tank guns. All this did a great job of raising the morale of our exhausted paratroopers. On the hill, Sommer and I were stationed in one of the trenches left by the Allied soldiers. To keep ourselves as safe as possible, from the side of the airfield we laid some sandbags next to the trench. After that, each of us began to look through the terrain with binoculars. In just a few minutes we discovered several enemy machine gun nests and 2 snipers. The latter were busy firing at our fighters disembarking from the airplanes and obviously did not notice us. Nevertheless, Sommer and I did not tempt fate, and firing almost simultaneously, we each killed an enemy sniper. After that, we took on the machine gunners. They were also busy firing on the airfield and did not suspect that they would be shot from the hill, so we finished them off without much trouble. Suddenly a bullet hit the sandbag next to Sommer's head. He immediately realized where it had come from and fired back. "Damn it, I missed," Sommer cursed, huddling in the trench. I followed suit. It was clear that we were being targeted by a sniper experienced enough to have spotted our position. "That son of a bitch was lucky," Sommer grinned crookedly. He ducked into his foxhole almost as soon as I pulled the trigger. "He's a good camouflage if we didn't see him right away," I said. "Yes, and he must have changed his position now. I don't think he's moved very far, though." "Is he?" "I'm sure he is, but we'll fool him." Sommer told me to carefully lift my helmet, placing it over my infantry shoulder blade. As soon as I did so, a bullet whizzed just below my helmet, piercing through the blade. At the same second, Sommer's shot rang out. "Great, I got him in the eye. We're done with him." Sommer, smiling, looked at me. After that, we began to behave more cautiously and immediately moved to another trench. Sommer decided that before that we were probably given away by the sun glare from the telescopic sight. And this time, we chose a position facing the eastern side of the hill. Now we could not be given away by the sun's rays, and besides, we had inserted a few olive branches into the camouflage nets attached to our helmets, which allowed us to blend in almost completely with the surrounding landscape. As we settled into our new position, we noticed several more machine gun nests. When we had disposed of the machine gunners, our job was essentially over. All afternoon, the 5th Mountain Division was busy landing on the island and regrouping. Its commander, Major General Julius Ringel, took charge of the main strike group. Sommer and I learned about all this from Conrad, who joined us in the evening. As it turned out, Conrad had also had a terrible night. One of the shells had exploded only 5 meters from his trench, and if Conrad had not been lying at the bottom of the trench when the shell hit, he would hardly have been able to talk to us again. Moreover, the British snipers at first managed to destroy several of his comrades, but soon the enemy snipers stopped firing. Perhaps this was also our merit, because we and Sommer destroyed several enemy snipers. In turn, we told Conrad that we had destroyed a fair number of enemy machine gunners. Yes, the machine gunners were not firing too heavily on us. I'm glad you were here, Conrad smiled. We talked while sitting in the trench. After a while, the shots and bursts of gunfire became more frequent. It seems that the British are awake again, I said. Conrad, do you want to be our gunner? Asked Summer. Conrad immediately picked up binoculars. In just an hour, he helped us to find another sniper and several machine gunners. When the intensity of the enemy fire was greatly reduced, Conrad exclaimed enthusiastically, "Damn it, I just find the targets, and you pull the trigger." And another enemy stopped shooting. He was delighted. Following his remark, another British shell exploded 100 meters away from us. Damn it, where the hell do these assholes hide their guns? Summer cursed. By nightfall, the entire hill was occupied by mountain shooters parachutists. On the side of the airfield were equipped especially many machine gun nests. We thoroughly prepared in case of a surprise attack by the enemy. Characteristically, we did not have time to remove all the Allied corpses lying on the hill, and many of them remained lying among our positions. We had another not very quiet night ahead of us. When it got dark, Summer and I managed to shoot a few careless enemy soldiers, aiming at the light of their cigarettes. After a while I had a dry ration supper and felt an overwhelming desire to sleep. Conrad and Summer, after eating, also felt how tired they were after the previous almost sleepless night. Around us were positions occupied by our own. Sentries had been posted who were to be on duty all night, so we could afford to get some sleep, and each of us slept until dawn. Early in the morning we were awakened by another contact. "Are you Sergeant Summer?" "Yes, I am," replied Summer. "I was ordered to escort you and the snipers who will be with you to the headquarters of General Ringel." "And what do they want us to do?" "You will accompany a battalion of mountain shooters. They're to flank the enemy artillery. You'll find out the rest on the spot." Together with Summer and Conrad, I started down the hill following the contact. In one of the buildings of the captured airfield, we were met by a staff officer. He explained to us that the snipers of the 5th Mountain Division were still quite inexperienced, while our successes were already on many people's lips. Accordingly, Summer and I were to accompany the battalion, which had the task to cross the mountains and attack the flank of the Allied troops. "You see what happens when you do your job too well," smirked Summer as soon as the officer left. When the staff officer returned, he showed us a map of the southeastern part of the mountains and filled us in on a number of details of the task before us. The British infantry was entrenched between Malling and Kanya. Behind the infantry was artillery, which was to be destroyed by a battalion of the 5th Mountain Division by crossing the mountains. Taking advantage of the situation, we insisted on taking Conrad with us as gunner. Before the mission, we were given a hot meal for the first time since landing on the island. We were also able to replenish our dry rations. This included being given a pack of lollipops, 2 cigars each, and 7 rounds of ammunition. And in addition, we were able to fill our flasks with clean water. In about an hour, we were near the mountain from which our route started, and began the ascent. This mountain was gentle enough that we could move without much trouble. But about an hour later we were attacked. One of the mountain gunners collapsed, struck by a bullet that hit him in the chest. We immediately lay low, hiding behind the mountain ledges that would give us some protection from the enemy, who was clearly above us. Conrad took out his binoculars and looked up. "There's a man up there with a sniper rifle," Conrad said to Summer and me. "He's wearing civilian clothes." When he finished saying that phrase, my carbines were already pointed at the target. We fired almost simultaneously, and the enemy sniper collapsed backward with 2 holes in his head. His rifle, hitting the rocks, flew down. "It was a partisan," said Summer. "The worst thing about guerrillas is that they look like ordinary civilians. They always try to attack you unexpectedly." We continued to climb for several more hours. Having risen to an altitude of about 1.5 kilometers above sea level, we could no longer be seen by the Allied soldiers below. A large part of the island was in front of us as if in the palm of our hands. Only to the east were the mountains blocking our view. The height of the mountains in the center of the island seemed incredible. It was terribly hot, about 40 degrees. Most of the soldiers, including the three of us, took off their field jackets and wrapped them around their heads to protect them from the sun. We had taken off our helmets even before that, as they literally burned our heads when they got hot in the sun. As night fell, the battalion set up camp on a fairly flat section of the mountainside. By this time, the temperature had begun to drop rapidly. Nevertheless, we did not venture to build fires. We feared that we might be attacked by guerrillas or enemy aviation, although it must be said, we never had to face it during the Cretan operation. To keep warm, I slept curled up. Frankly, it was far from the most comfortable night of my life. Throughout the night, I could hear the sound of shells and bombs exploding from somewhere below. Attacking the Allied positions, our bombers were dropping huge 500-kilogram bombs on them, and the rumble of their explosions could reach the highest mountain peaks. At dawn, we continued our way through the mountains, and again it was terribly hot. There was practically no water left in our flasks. Shortly before noon, we spotted a waterfall. We turned towards it to get some water. The cold water tasted amazing. I drank the whole flask at once. We dunked our heads in the waterfall. We laughed. It was something mesmerizing to watch the water pouring down from somewhere above. Looking at the waterfall, I even forgot about the war for a few moments. But we had to keep moving toward our goal. I took the documents out of the pockets of my jacket, soaked it in the waterfall, and tied it around my head. After that, the sun didn't seem so scorching to me anymore. The battalion commander decided to climb to the next mountain directly over the waterfall, since we only had to jump 1.5 meters. It was not difficult at all. But of course, many of us were afraid, because if you failed to jump, you would inevitably crash on the rocks. Nevertheless, we all made it safely over the waterfall. True, a few soldiers managed to almost fall down, but they were immediately picked up by their comrades, and so nothing terrible happened to any of them. It took about an hour for the whole battalion to get over the falls. We advanced very slowly as we had to step on a narrow rocky path. In doing so, we even tied ourselves with ropes that were in the mountain riflemen's equipment. Tied to each other, we could be sure that if one of us snapped down, the others would be able to hold on to him. A couple hours later, we came across the mutilated bodies of 2 German parachutists. Their heads had been cut off and were lying side by side. The bodies each had several bullet holes in them. These parachutists had probably landed in the central part of the island and were trying to reach their own in the Maleme area. But who could have done this to them? That was the question each of us was asking ourselves. Suddenly, rifle shots rained down on us. We were attacked by about 20 guerrillas who were hiding behind rocks that overhung high above our heads. Several of the mountain gunners were immediately killed or wounded. The others tried to find some cover from the bullets and began to return fire. Sommer and I immediately raised our rifles and began firing at the guerrillas. Even though they were hiding behind rocks, they were easy targets for snipers like us. Sommer and I managed to take out 4 or 5 guerrillas each. The rest realized what was going on while we were changing magazines and fled away. By this point, about a dozen mountain gunners were badly wounded. Some of them were groaning. The medics immediately rushed around them, and a platoon of riflemen went up the slope to make sure that the guerrillas really fled. Soon the guys from this platoon cheerfully shouted to us that only the bodies were left near the rocks, and the rest of the guerrillas must have run away. We should still be on our guard, said Sommer, and hung his rifle on his shoulder. After that he was silent for a while longer, and then broke out into profanity. Conrad and I stared at him in surprise. I just shot a woman and a boy, Sommer said. What do you mean? I did not understand. Gunther, among the partisans I killed, there was 1 woman and a teenager. I shuddered at the thought that I may have also killed a teenager or a woman. In the turmoil of the battle after the surprise attack of the guerrillas, I had aimed so quickly that I hadn't even looked at the faces of my victims. Well, I was glad I hadn't gone with a platoon of riflemen to look at the guerrillas. After a couple of minutes, Sommer looked calm again. He didn't talk about what had happened anymore. We had to leave the bodies of the dead behind, and we carried the seriously wounded with us. We moved forward until darkness fell. All the fighters were constantly on guard, but the partisans did not attack us again. The only serious problem was still the unbearable heat, all the more so because we had to use our water very sparingly. Advancing along the narrow mountain paths in the dark was too dangerous, so we set up camp. After a guerrilla attack in the morning, we decided to entrench for the night. But in the part of the mountains where we were, this was impossible. So we had nothing left but to choose for our camp an area more or less protected by rocky ledges. That night was even colder than the previous one. And when I woke up in the morning, I felt as if I had slept on bare rocks. In fact, that's exactly what it felt like. It took us all the next day to get to the rear of the British artillery positions. We could clearly hear the gunshots, and, orienting ourselves on them, we were able to establish the location of the guns. At the end, the battalion commander decided that we should rest and start the attack in the morning. The next day, May 25, we took up a position on a dominant height above the British trenches. We soon discerned trenches camouflaged with camouflage netting. Looking closely at them and listening to the rumble of the guns, we were soon convinced that our hunch was correct. The British artillery was located there. Before the attack, Summer had been instructed to instruct a platoon of snipers, part of a battalion of mountain riflemen. Almost all of the snipers in the platoon were complete novices. Sommer explained to them how best to choose their hiding places in a given situation and which targets to fire at first. There was nothing more he could do for them in such a short time. It was clear that not all of them would survive the battle. The battalion also had a number of mortarmen. They set up their 80mm mortars, aiming them at the British artillery positions. Our machine gunners also positioned themselves to cover the battlefield with fire as effectively as possible. On the signal of the battalion commander, the attack began. We all opened fire almost simultaneously. A hail of machine gun bursts, rifle bullets, and mortar shells rained down on the British positions below. We completely succeeded in taking the enemy by surprise. A few British even stood in line outside the field kitchen, lined up to get breakfast. It was at this point that they were mowed down by machine gun fire. The snipers of the mountain rifle platoon opened fire on the enemy machine gunners. Sommer and I at the same time sought out the British snipers and destroyed them with our accurate shots. The nearest British trench was less than 500 meters from us. Our positions rose about 100 meters above the enemy positions. Because of this, the trenches offered little protection to enemy soldiers. Moreover, the sandbags laid out to further protect the trenches were mostly on the west side, from where the British were expecting a possible attack. Mines fired from mortars rained down on the trenches where the enemy's guns were located. The artillerymen were fired upon by German machine gunners. At the same time, the wooden supports that held the camouflage netting that camouflaged the guns began to fly apart, and soon they became perfectly visible to us. Characteristically, none of these guns turned toward us to return fire. The British were taking heavy casualties, but they kept fighting. Their heavy machine guns were firing at our battalion positions. Sommer and I tried to destroy the enemy machine gunners as fast as we could. Conrad held binoculars and helped us find our targets. Our other snipers were also firing at the machine gunners. But not all the shots of the newcomers were successful. And after a while, one of them, who was 5 meters away from us, suddenly collapsed with a hole in his head. He was followed by another who was killed by a precise shot in the chest. He was still twitching in agony, but it was obvious that he could not be helped. The rest of the young snipers were confused and stopped shooting. "Damn it, keep fighting." Sommer yelled at them, "You'll be shot if you don't keep your mouth shut." As if to confirm his words, a British sniper's bullet entered the head of another of our new recruits. But this time, I had pinpointed the British sniper's position. He was at the very edge of a long trench 400 meters away from us. I aimed there and waited for him to stick out at least the edge of his head. I myself tried to stay out of the trench as little as possible. But the Briton outsmarted me. In about half a minute, the barrel of his rifle suddenly stuck out from the opposite edge of the trench. Perhaps he was aiming at me, but he didn't get a shot off. Summer's bullet beat him to it. Several of the new recruits saw Summer take out the enemy sniper. This encouraged them. They forced themselves to pull themselves together and kept firing. Everyone around them was covered in mud, and often also in blood, their own and others. Screams and groans became audible through the rumble of battle. I tried to pull the bolt as fast as possible and looked for more and more enemy machine gunners. Wherever I looked through my scope, I saw dead and dying British soldiers. Suddenly, another mortar shell exploded a few meters away from us. One of the shrapnel hit my helmet so hard that my ears rang. Fortunately, the shrapnel was already in the air, and my helmet withstood the impact. I felt my head and face. There was no blood. I had a headache, but much less than I'd had the morning after a beer haul with Summer and Conrad. I had to keep fighting. "Find me some mortars," I shouted to Conrad. "I'll try," he replied. We both looked over the terrain. I saw another machine gunner and shot at him. The machine gun went silent. A moment later, I heard Conrad's joyful cry. "There they are, the bastards behind the jeep." He pointed to me with his hand. When I took my eyes off the scope, I saw the English jeep that Conrad was pointing at. Aiming my telescopic sight there, I saw 2 pairs of mortars right behind the jeep, which were firing at our positions. At the same second, I shot one of the loaders. His partner's nerves gave out and he ran, but my next bullet beat him. But the other 2 mortars were not confused and lay down behind the jeep. I couldn't get them from there. I fired at the jeep at random. I must say, it only happens in the movies that a car explodes when a bullet hits it, and if you use a tracer and hit the gas tank, the car can explode. Otherwise, you have no chance of blowing up the car. However, my bullet must have scared one of the mortars. Out of fear, he did something stupid and rushed to escape. As soon as he was in my line of sight, I shot him in the torso. I don't know whether I killed him or wounded him, but the 4th mortar man was smarter. He stayed behind the jeep, and I couldn't get him. But the main thing is that they stopped firing mortars at us. "Look, a tank," I heard Conrad's voice. "There are machine gunners there too, damn them," cussed Summer. The tank stood in a trench, the edges of which were covered with sandbags. The machine gunners' positions were behind them. Their trench was also lined with sandbags. It was about 500 meters away from us, and we could only see the barrels of the machine guns. Summer and I resigned ourselves to the fact that we could not destroy the tank with our rifles, and waited for at least one of the machine gunners to poke his head out. I don't know how those machine gunners managed it, but they spotted us before we could shoot any of them. Their machine guns started firing in the direction of our position, and after that a tank cannon hit us. It was only by a miracle that we managed to lie down at the bottom of the trench. We were unharmed, but we could hear machine gun bullets ricocheting very close by, and none of us 3 dared to raise our heads. It went on like that for a few minutes, and then we heard a great explosion. It was followed by silence, and I looked outside. It turned out that the British tank's ammunition had exploded. Most likely, it was hit by a mine fired by one of our mortars. Apparently, it hit just in the ammunition. Since it detonated, the hull of the tank was burning. The machine gunners who were hiding behind the tank did not fire anymore. Most likely, few of them survived. The effect of this sudden explosion was such that almost everyone stopped firing for a few seconds. And then I heard the shouts of our officers. They were yelling orders from the battalion commander. Retreat to the mountains. It was the right decision. Despite the success of our attack, on the side of the Allies remained a significant numerical advantage. In addition, many of our men were already dead. We retreated, leaving their bodies behind, taking only half of their identification medallions. The British fired after us, but their fire was not very effective, and we lost only a few men in the retreat. Conrad, Summer, and I reached safety unharmed. What was the outcome of the battle? Our group somehow managed to accomplish the task before us. We destroyed the British artillery, and now those of us who survived deserve at least a short rest. I chose a suitable spot and sat down on the ground with Conrad and Summer. We were soaked with sweat that we hurried to take off our shirts. The sun was scorching. I took a greedy sip from the flask, then poured a small amount of water on my head and rubbed it through my hair. It made me feel a little better. Our stomachs were rumbling by now, so we took out our dry rations. So did many other parachutists stationed nearby. After eating, I counted to myself the guys from the sniper platoon. Only half of the platoon had survived. After about an hour, we could hear the rumble of artillery pieces and bomb bursts coming from far away. A sergeant who came up to us reported the order of the battalion commander. As soon as the rest of the division reached the beach below, we were to join the attack against the Allied troops on the outskirts of Kenya. However, we already knew from experience that our troops are unlikely to advance to the beach too quickly. Therefore, some of the soldiers were ordered to dig small trenches on the outskirts of our camp in case of a surprise attack from the British or local guerrillas. Summer said we should also dig a trench for ourselves. This seemed an unnecessary precaution to Conrad and me, but we trusted Summer's experience and set to work, albeit with some reluctance. The ground on the mountain was quite hard, and we were exhausted from the recent fighting. Add to that the terrible heat. We were all soaking wet while we dug the trench. I would hardly be mistaken if I said that while doing so, Conrad and I both honored Summer to the hilt. For the rest of the day, until darkness fell, the rumblings of battle gradually approached, but our comrades never reached the beach. Our comrades advanced even more slowly than we expected. The Allies, despite the loss of artillery, had ample forces and fought desperately. Toward evening, the heat began to subside a little. Conrad got some playing cards somewhere. He suggested that Summer and I play scat. When we were playing, one of the officers from the battalion command came up to us. We stood in front of him and saluted. "At ease," he said at once. "Men, you have done a great job today. I'm very pleased that you acted together with our unit." "Glad to try, Mr. Lieutenant," replied Summer. The lieutenant shook hands with each of us. "One of you should give me a shooting lesson when this war is over." He smiled. "I'll need it when I'm hunting." "Always ready if you'll put on a beer," I joked. All four of us laughed amicably. When the lieutenant left, we played one more game and then went to sleep in our foxhole. The night was cold again, and we lay close together to keep warm in our not very warm uniforms. At dawn, we heard artillery shells exploding a little closer, but still at a distance. Our comrades needed to advance a considerable distance further to reach the beach. We had breakfast with the remains of our dry rations. I kept my bag of candy in case I got hungry. Besides, a happy idea occurred to me, and I exchanged 2 of my cigars for some of the dry rations of one of the mountain gunners. Thus I had a little extra food left, and I had no need for cigars anyway. I didn't smoke. Conrad, unlike me, was not going to part with his cigars. Still, the command should have given us extra rations before we went on this operation, he grumbled. Of course they should have, I agreed. But who knew it would take so long? But even hungry, we have to do whatever it takes to win here. Summer looked at us with a conspiratorial look. Do you know why? Why? We all asked at once. Because from Crete, the British can get to Romanian oil. And without that oil, it will be hard for us to fight Britain. Well, Summer knew more than we did. He was friends with some of the officers, and now it was clear to us why we needed to take Crete so badly. Then we will capture this island at any cost, I said to myself. It was clear to me that a serious war with Britain was inevitable, and Crete was, in fact, the beginning of it. By noon, the German troops still hadn't reached the beach. The anticipation was weighing on me. When you're waiting for a battle, it's always very hard emotionally. You're plagued by anxiety. But when the battle starts, you are already acting. There is no time to be afraid. The only thing that was pleasant was that the clouds appeared in the sky. The heat subsided, and soon it rained a little. We were all glad of it, but it passed quickly. Around 1 o'clock, German Dornier bombers appeared in the sky. Many of ours started waving happily to the pilots. "Probably they will drop us food and ammunition," suggested Conrad. And indeed, containers flew from the planes. At least we didn't expect it to be anything other than containers. "Well, I told you so," Conrad said enthusiastically. Suddenly, I thought the containers looked different, and a few seconds later, the first container hit the ground and exploded. They were bombs. They started exploding at the opposite end of the camp. The explosion was so strong that I could clearly feel the ground shaking under my feet. Already the first explosions had killed at least 10 soldiers at once. Screams began to erupt from all sides. "Take cover." I immediately jumped into my foxhole with Sommer and Conrad. Conrad's head was badly scratched by shrapnel. Sommer and I immediately bandaged him up. Meanwhile, the bombers had turned around and were making another run at the camp. "Damn it, we must fire a flare so that they realize we are our own," shouted Sommer. Surely he was not the only one who had thought of it. And just a second later, several flares flew into the air at once. But the planes ignored our signals and continued their bombardment. "What are they doing? Are they crazy?" I shouted, trying to overpower the rumble of exploding bombs. "They must have mistaken us for British," Sommer yelled back at me just as loudly. We were huddled in the trench, each of us wearing helmets. I prayed that no bomb would fall into our trench. After another bomb exploded, I was angry, and I picked up my sniper rifle. Sommer put his hand on its barrel. "Gunther, put it away. You must not shoot at them." "Why not? It will only convince these assholes that we are the enemy. Our only chance of survival is for them to figure it out." I squeezed into the trench again. Another bomb exploded in our compound not far from us. From the edges of the trench, earth sprinkled down on us. My teeth banged against each other, and I started groping with my tongue to see if they were all in place. In a state of shock, I looked up and saw the head of a mountain gunner lying next to our trench. When I looked out, I saw that his headless body was lying next to a nearby trench that had turned into a crater. The bomb had hit right there, and the blast wave had thrown the body out. I was hysterical, crying. Sommer dragged me to the bottom of the trench. The bombardment lasted more than half an hour. After that, the planes flew back north, where they had come from. By this time, I had come to my senses. Sommer and I crawled out of the trench and began to help the medics drag the bodies of the wounded and killed. We learned that the trench where the radio station was located had taken a direct hit. Several German flags were waved to the pilots, but they never saw them. We were all in a depressed mood, everyone talking openly about the incompetence of those who had directed the bombers at us. Even the officers were mad as hell at the command. Sommer and I approached an 18-year-old boy from the mountain riflemen who had been wounded. This soldier had lost one of his eyes in an air raid. Sommer tried to comfort him. "You'll come home, boy. You're lucky to be alive." The boy only groaned in response. He must have been in unbearable pain. And I shuddered to think what would have happened if I had come home with one eye or arm or leg missing. Would Ingrid need me in that case? I suppose so. But still, I'd be a burden to her. I forced myself not to think about it. After a while, a battle broke out down below as our comrades reached the beach, and we were ordered to attack. We went down to our former positions, from which we had retreated during the previous battle. From there, we could already see the advancing German troops. They were only a few hundred meters away from us. German infantrymen were continuously firing, throwing grenades into the British trenches and gradually occupying them one by one. German artillery worked continuously on the remnants of the British troops. Many of the Allied soldiers began to retreat. For a few seconds, I just looked around. During this time, I witnessed a German mine fall into one of the trenches where the British had stacked their dying comrades. Almost all were killed at once. Meanwhile, the German fighters who were on the beach, having seen us, increased the power of their offensive. We, snipers, immediately opened fire on the enemy. all the more so that now we were confronted by a much smaller force than the day before. Our machine gunners and ordinary riflemen had by this time also opened fire.